Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we're going to begin the funeral services for Daniel Goldman Cedarbaum. I invite everybody to take a moment to be sure that your cell phones have been turned off. Rabbi Jeffrey Weil will be officiating this morning.
Adonai, ma Adam vateda ehu, ben enosh vatichesh vehu, Adam lehevodama, yamav kitzel over, babokir tzitz v'chalav, le'erev imalel v'yavesh, tashev enosh ad daka v'tomer shuvu b'nei Adam. These are the words of the psalmist saying, Eternal God, what are we that you have regard for us? What are we that you would even be mindful of us? We're all of us just a breath, our days a passing shadow. We come and go like grass, which in the morning it shoots up and is renewed, and in the evening it fades and withers. But God, you cause all of us to return unto dust, saying, Shuvu b'nei Adam, return, O mortal ones. Would that we were wise, and would that we understood whither we go from here, for when we die we carry nothing with us, not our glory, not our riches. But God, you say, Shmor tam urei yashar, mark the wholehearted, behold the upright. Those are the ones who shall find peace. Friends, we gather very sadly, still with a sense of shock this morning, to remember and say farewell to one who was Tam v'yashar. He was wholehearted, he was upright, he was Daniel Goldman Cedarbaum. It's my honor to call forward to lead us in Psalm 15, Rabbi Alan Kensky, Rabbi Emeritus of Beth Hillel B'nai Emunah, and a member of Minyan Shirat HaAgam, Rabbi Kensky.
I read Psalm 15, which describes the person of integrity, which Dan most assuredly was. Mizmor leDavid, Adonai mi yagur be'ohalecha, mi yishkon bahar kodshecha. Holech tamim ufoel tzedek, v'dover emet bilvavo, lo ragal al leshono. Lo asa l'reyehu ra'a, v'cherpa lo nasa al krovo. Nivze ve'enav nim'as, ve'et yirei Adonai yichabed. Nishba lahara ve'lo yamir, kaspo lo natan beneshech, ve'shochad al naki lo lakach. Ose ele lo yimot le'olam. O Lord, who shall dwell in your sanctuary? Who shall abide upon your holy mountain? One who lives with integrity, does what is right, and speaks the truth in his heart, who has no slander upon his tongue, who does no evil to his fellow human being, who does not reproach his neighbor. In his eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who revere the Lord. He takes an oath even to his own harm and does not change. He does not lend money at usurious interest. He does not take a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things shall stand firm forever.
You'll find the 23rd Psalm in our handouts. To lead us in the 23rd Psalm, also of Beth Hillel B'nai Emunah, Rabbi Nate Crane, and Cantor Pavel Reutman.
echsar binod sheyarbitzeni hanemei menuchot yenach aleini nafshi shovev yankeini b'maglei tzedek yankeini b'maglei tzedek leman shemo gam ki elech begeitz al mavet lo yirhara ki ata imadi shiftecha umishantecha ema yinachamuni Tarok lefanai shulchan neged sorerai dishanta vashemen roshi kosi revaya achtov vacheset ירדפוני כל ימי חיי ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך ימים אדוני רואי לא אחסר, אדוני רואי לא אחסר.
We'll join together in the English of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Lakol zman, ve'et lechol chefetz tachat hashemayim. For everything there is a season, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot that which is planted, a time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve, a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, a time when we must refrain from our embraces, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep, a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time for silence and a time for speaking. And so this is a time for speaking about Dan Cedarbaum. When not chopping wood a group of lumberjacks in northwestern Ukraine thought it would be a good idea to get together to study Mishnah. So they formed a little organization called the Society of Woodchoppers of Berdichev for the study of Mishnah. And a book with the stamp of that group is actually among the archives, the collection at YIVO. If Daniel Goldman Cedarbaum were a Ukrainian Jewish lumberjack, he would have joined, nay, he would have founded that organization. He would have organized its meetings. He would have brought in speakers, perhaps other lumberjacks with serious text chops, and he would have covered their expenses. And on the off chance that Dan had not been a Ukrainian Jewish lumberjack, he would have supported this group anyway. For what made Dan Cedarbaum so happy is Jews coming together to examine our texts, study our history, sing our songs, pray our prayers, and so forth. Rabbi Hillel famously counseled, Al tifrosh min hatzibor. Do not separate yourself from the community, from Pirkei Avot. For Dan, that little exhortation from Rabbi Hillel was downright banal, redundant to who he was as a Jew and a human being. Dan was wholeheartedly and inextricably linked to his community or communities. He and Karen, too, were deeply committed to shuls, minyanim, local organizations, major national organizations, study groups, and more. And of course, that most important community, the community of family, the community of kin, which mourns in the deepest way at this time. I often refer to Dan simply as Cedarbaum, and he was a proud Cedarbaum, son of Bernard and the Honorable Miriam Goldman Cedarbaum, older brother to Jonathan. Dan and Jonathan at any given time might have espied their parents reading. They're all voracious readers. Political biographies for Bernie, for Miriam, perhaps the trial of Joan of Arc in Latin. On the other hand, Dan might also have been found in their Scarsdale backyard with lifelong friends Steve Merkel and younger brother Peter. Those two older brothers would chase their younger brothers in a game they called simply Kill. But Dan was actually a good big brother. In December, he forwarded to me an article about Jonathan's latest appointment, and the note that Dan wrote on the top of the forwarded email to me simply said, "From a proud brother." Dan matriculated at Harvard. He majored in the history of science. His thesis on Thomas Kuhn was also called simply Paradigms, a work that has been printed and reprinted and abundantly cited in academic work throughout the decades. I did not know Dan's major in college. I didn't know about that thesis. I knew Dan as the man of and everywhere throughout the Jewish community. I knew him as the brilliant man, deeply immersed on matters Jewish, and especially intensely focused on all matters Kaplan, Mordechai. But when he and Karen began dating at Harvard Law School, the couple had other interests entirely. Dan's Jewish interests had not yet emerged or blossomed. They complemented each other. As Karen said, they supplemented each other, expanding each other's horizons. Karen introduced Dan to classical music. Dan was a great gourmet. He loved fine food. He loved food. He actually, if there was a dish that served 8, 4 would be for Dan. It's a good thing that he did exercise regularly, biking, tennis, and more. He was an appreciative consumer of Karen's cooking and her baking. And he was the wine connoisseur as well, French, Burgundies, Chablis in particular. He would choose the right wine at the table for any meal, any given occasion. Dan and Karen shared a love for most things French as well. His first gift to Karen, which she still possesses, was and you have to picture this moment, a 3-volume paperback set of essays by French philosopher Montaigne. The books were not wrapped. With one hand, he handed them to Karen and said, "Here." It may not seem romantic, but the books were in French, so I guess that counts for something. But Dan, in fact, was très romantique. He was very romantic. Flowers for Karen every Shabbat, and working with Evanston artist Yves Alfier to create jewelry for Karen, some of which she wears at this time. As young lawyers, they came to Chicago. Dan first clerked for a federal judge and then worked for Dancoma and Flam doing corporate and tax work. But Dan discovered there at that firm much more than law work. Some firm members were deeply immersed in the Reconstructionist movement. It was not a completely new thing to Dan. After belonging to a conservative congregation in Scarsdale, Bernie and Miriam, they joined a Reconstructionist congregation after that, so Dan had some background in it, but now Dan really began to learn. And when Dan Cedarbaum set his mind to something, to learn something, he really focused and he really absorbed. And so with a preternatural focus, a focus that most of us do not have, he began learning about the life and teachings of Mordechai Kaplan. He learned it and they lived it. Dan and Karen joined the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation, sponsoring programs, of course, serving on the board, of course. They were living together at this point. They lived together for several years, resisting the institution of marriage. But Bernie Cedarbaum kept talking them, and they got married in 1987, Rabbi Arnie Rocklis officiating. And they created a loving home, a loving, fun, enriching home for Jacob and Samuel. We'll hear from them soon. Dan eventually joined Sidley and Austin, and then co-founded Winter and Cedarbaum, focusing on sophisticated trust, estates, and immigration matters, which often brought Dan to Europe. And then he was a solo practitioner for a while as well. When we met, Dan and I, he honestly did not talk too much about his legal career. We would always talk about family first, who was doing what, who was going where, and so forth. With characteristic menschlichkeit, he always offered to help if he could be in any way helpful with Julie's and mine, our children's paths. He learned that one of our children was considering a certain college. Dan, of course, knew the president of that college. That's what Dan was like. And he said he'd be very happy to help. Let me know, he said. And then he would delve into Jewish interests. Not about his attainments, of course, although, he had all those attainments. The Reconstructionist Rabbinical College Board, United Jewish Communities Executive Committee, National Council of Synagogues Board, Limud Board, 4-year term, of course, as president, and then leading professional positions within the Jewish Reconstructionist Federation, co-founder of Minyan Shirat HaAgam, host, most recently, of the pandemic era, what we call the Cedarbaum Backyard Minyan, executive director and president, and co-founder of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, of course, as well, and a member of a host of synagogues in seemingly every time zone. Dan's overarching interest, passion, was to create various meaningful ways for all of us to connect, to enlighten our Jewish lives in ways not restricted by any particular movement's customs. And so he could be progressive and also traditional. He planned that great multi-day conference featuring this is on Jewish music and liturgy, in Hyde Park, featuring a wide and wild Jewish cross-section of talented singers and thinkers. I remember that night that I was there, I stood with him in the back of KAM Isaiah Israel, that sanctuary. We stood next to each other. He was in his blazer that he often wore, and he just seemed satisfied. For all his work, tremendous efforts in every possible way yielded great success. Dan created opportunities, legions of rabbis and cantors and scholars to get together, to meet each other, to teach, to share their wisdom and their ideas in ways big and small, like those major programs, even like me, the ability of me to land where I am at Ezra Havanim, the Niles Township Jewish congregation. That was Dan's connection that made that happen. So I'm grateful. He would bring to town wonderful teachers for lunch and learns and Shabbatones, sessions with the Chicago Board of Rabbis, and more. He was a supreme connector. He knew people, and he'd often say, "You guys should meet," and then he'd make the introduction. Go to Facebook, other social media, it tells a story. You'll find scores and scores of comments of people brimming with gratitude for how they connected Dan and gave them and how he gave them opportunities to meet each other, to teach, and so forth, and to learn. I learned at those Cedarbaum sponsored programs, but primarily I learned panim el panim, face to face, sitting across from Dan Cedarbaum. We would meet for sushi in Evanston, and Dan would begin to reference people, apparently luminaries, who sounded to me vaguely familiar, maybe. Dan often assumed that we knew more than we did, and just as Karen's dad would tell her mom Anne to start at the end of her stories, because those stories tended to go long, Karen would admonish Dan to start at the beginning, to contextualize what he was talking about, because people sometimes ended up a little bit lost when Dan started talking. I did. He did start at the beginning for me, though, when he assigned me reading material by Kaplan when I first came to Ezra Habanim, Niles Township. I read the material. This is 3 sessions of assignments, and then he'd come in and join me in my office to teach me, to clarify, to share with me. But truly, Dan Cedarbaum taught best simply through his being and his bearing, his menschlichkeit. He was a mensch. He was excellent, for instance, at expressing appreciation for the good that other people do, big things, little things. We call it hakarat hatov, recognizing the good things. Just do sweet things. If I had like a little message to my congregation that he would receive by email or a bulletin article that he liked, he'd just sometimes send me an email in response with one word. It would just say, nice, sometimes with an exclamation point. Not effusive, just sincere and appreciated. Losing Daniel G. Cedarbaum. This is a tangible loss for our community. It feels like a material loss for all of us. It's hard to wrap our heads around it. We read in Talmud that Shmuel HaKatan, the sage, was buried with his notebook. But Dan Cedarbaum's notebook, his legacy, remains. The writings, articles, the organizations, the documents collected, the recordings found, the students of his all remain. Dan's voice, that made-for-radio voice, still echoes in our minds, his laughter as well, and his legacy of love, of course. Dan as husband and life partner to Karen, father to Jacob and Samuel, brother to Jonathan, in-law and uncle to so many, Anne, Jacob's, Alice, Dahlia, Louis, Laura, James, and cat niece Esme, Julie, Philip, Jesse, Andy, and Erica, Jessica, Michael, Benjamin, and Matthew, James, Laura, Leah, and Maeve. We happen to be reading in my synagogue at one of my weekly adult education classes the book of Daniel. Daniel was a leader and a counselor in exile with the Jews in Babylon. Daniel. He maintained Jewish practice. He insisted on maintaining Jewish practice in an inhospitable environment. And our Daniel here, Dan Cedarbaum, leader, teacher, chaver, friend. He guided us all toward meaningful Jewish practice in a complicated and evolving world. Daniel hativ eta uta'im. Daniel, we read in the book of Daniel, Daniel responded with wisdom and discernment. He did indeed. Zichrono livracha. May his memory be for blessing. Amen. We have a few speakers. First, I will read a note from Rabbi Michael Belinsky, who was in Jerusalem at this time, and I had called him and with this news, and he responded with this email to me, which he asked me to share. Jeffrey, he wrote, I listened to your phone message Saturday night after Shabbat, and I'm just sitting here crying in my hotel room in Jerusalem. Dan was a student, colleague, and friend. Our relationship began over a Friday Talmud group he initiated in the mid-90s, which continued until what became its last session only a few weeks ago. I am proud that we worked together on our first project while I was president of the Chicago Board of Rabbis, and he chaired the old JUF Synagogue Federation Commission. We started a series of Beit Midrash study sessions in which members from different denominations sat together to study text, followed by a panel of their rabbis. They continued in Evanston over time and became one Jewish Evanston. I could go on, but what I loved about Dan was his pursuit of knowledge, his organizational skills, his willingness to dream the Kaplan Center into being. Dan was an active learner, a constant student, a thoughtful voice in the ongoing Jewish conversation, and a generous supporter of important programs. But in the end, for me, he moved beyond being a student and a colleague and became a close friend, a friendship that I think he knew I treasured. I so miss him. From Rabbi Michael Belinsky. I now am honored to call forward Rabbi Jeffrey Schein, a colleague at the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, the senior consultant for Jewish education for the center. Rabbi Schein.
I am a shaliach, a messenger of nichum, of comfort, appreciation, and sadness. Any messenger must be clear about whose name he's speaking. The Harvard Dan would call this cognitive attribution. The Jewishly literate Dan would call it b'shem omro, or in this case, b'shem omra. So I have regards from Rabbi Elise Wechterman, the executive director of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, and Rabbi Deborah Waxman, the president of Reconstructing Judaism. Both asked that I convey their membership's profound appreciation for Dan's unswerving commitment to the Reconstructionist movement and his dedication to advancing the thought of Mordechai Kaplan. They also asked that I pass on their condolences to Karen, Jacob, Sam, and Jonathan. B'shem Dr. Eric Kaplan, in the name of Eric Kaplan, Executive Vice President of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, who is also speaking b'shmi in my name and the name of Dr. Mel Scalt, as well as the members of the board of the center. As many of you know, Dan spent much of his last 10 years running the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. Dan was a co-founder of the center and its executive director. In truth, he was the center of the center, the force that made the work possible. We, the members of the staff and board of directors, had the pleasure of working alongside Dan in the planning and execution of the Kaplan Center's work. Along the way, we gained some insight into Dan as a person as well. Dan was at heart a Jewish studies scholar. His interest in classical Jewish texts, Mordechai Kaplan, and modern Jewish life was boundless, and he pursued his study with energy, seriousness, devotion, and passion. Yes, passion. There was true joy and excitement in his voice when he called to share and to discuss something that he, or someone whom he had hired, had found in one of the many Reconstructionist-related archives that Dan explored. Dan was also at heart a lawyer. We'd go back and forth with him on a document and then see that the final version was so much more elegant and precise than what we had suggested. Dan would begin all of our online programs by informing participants that the program was being recorded and that their asking a question or otherwise speaking will be deemed to constitute consent to our recording and putting it on our website. He would always preface that statement by apologizing for being so lawyerly, but no one bought it. The apology was never convincing. The Kaplan Center benefited greatly from Dan's lawyerliness. Dan had a gift for networking. When he encountered an article, a book, or an organization or person that interested him, he reached out to them, and he often found a way to incorporate them into the ongoing life of the Kaplan Center. So much of our work was made possible and enriched by the relationships that Dan built. Dan was generous with time and money. So many worthy projects would not exist without his generosity. And Dan was also gracious. He was careful to thank everyone who contributed to a program and also to point out any member of the Kaplan Center board who might be participating in the event. Although, and here's the irony, although he was the public face of so much of our work, he never intentionally drew attention to his way. He had a cultivated anevut, humility, and he was, in fact, remarkably uncomfortable when one of us would thank him publicly for his work. Shifting now to myself, Bishmi, in my own name, I was the beneficiary of Dan's generosity and networking when in 2015 he asked me to join the center as the senior consultant for Jewish education. A good deal of my writing and speaking on behalf of the center has focused broadly on 21st century Judaism, more narrowly on Judaism in a digital age, and most particularly about Judaism during the pandemic. I find it supremely ironic that Dan brings me up short, even at the time of his death. I really should have been less naive, but when I was working through the fog of hearing of his death, I was also struggling to find the link that would allow me to join virtually at the funeral. But then I wouldn't have had the opportunity that Dan and the Cedarbaum family has now provided me to understand more deeply from Mishnah Peah, the mitzvah of Harayon, of showing up in the fullest, most embodied sense of the word. Thank you, Dan, and the entire Cedarbaum family for that. In conclusion, I join my voice with Eric's. Dan, knowing you has been a great blessing. We cannot believe that you are gone. We will cherish forever the conversations that we had with you and the many experiences you made possible. We will never forget you. We'll do our very best to perpetuate the work of the Kaplan Center, the institution that you created and steered with such intelligence and menschlichkeit.
Dan's brother, Jonathan.
Before I begin, I want to thank all those who have come before me at the podium for your very beautiful remarks and your beautiful songs. And I want to thank all of you who've come today to uplift my brother's memory, and perhaps even more important, for enriching his life. 5 years ago, my brother Dan and I gave a joint eulogy at our mom's funeral. We stood shoulder to shoulder with our arms wrapped around each other and alternated speaking the interwoven portions of our remarks. When one of us hesitated or stumbled, the other offered the word needed to move forward. When one of us choked up with sadness, the other offered a tighter hug around the shoulder. At the time, a number of folks remarked how unusual it was to see two grown men joining together in this way. But for my brother Dan and me, it was a natural reflection of how throughout our lives we had shared experiences small and large, mostly moments of fun and laughter and accomplishment, but also times of challenge. That pattern began when we were kids. Dan and I grew up as part of what seems a statistically improbable collection of big brother, little brother pairs, as Rabbi Weil mentioned in part. Bobby and Andy Jordan, Bennett and Doug Rushkoff, and above all, Stephen and Peter Merkel. Among our neighborhood friends, our last name, Cedarbaum, often gave way to take off nicknames, including the unfortunately unkosher Cheddar Burger, shortened to the perhaps halakhically safer Cheddar. Dan was Big Cheddar, and of course I was Little Cheddar. While the big brothers had their own activities, at least my big brother made sure to include his little brother to the maximum extent possible. And certainly in the uncountable hours we spent playing street hockey and basketball with a larger group of boys at the Green Acres School playground. Dan's prowess as a street hockey player, not to mention as an ice hockey player, which he pursued on both frozen ponds and rinks, was much greater than mine. But in the sometimes Darwinian picking of teammates on the playground, he was always happy to include me on his team. So too, although Dan was a much more skilled bridge player than I ever was, he would often take me along to be his partner at The Deck, a local bridge club he frequented in high school, even though he knew I would be a drag on the quest for master points. Of course, in many activities, Dan and I were not partners. As the older brother, Dan was the pathbreaker, and I was the one following behind along the trail he had marked out. When it came to academic and intellectual achievement, that could sometimes be a daunting task. Dan was typically the smartest kid in the class, and when I would turn up 3 years later in the same class led by the same teacher, well, let's just say it was sometimes a struggle to meet professorial expectations. One of the paths I followed Dan on was the route to college. There, his brilliance blossomed, particularly, as Rabbi Weil said, in history and philosophy of science, his field of concentration. If I can be allowed to add a little bit more about Thomas Kuhn, his senior thesis analyzed the intellectual roots of a seminal work in the philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Dan's paper not only won the departmental thesis prize, but a few years later was published in a leading academic journal, in part, I will confess, because his little brother urged him to submit it for consideration. The offices of that journal happened to be located in Oxford, England, where I was studying when the article was published, and I still vividly remember biking to the journal's offices to get hard copies the day they became available, calling Dan to let him know his article had emerged into the world, and sending him a package of offprints. Dan's article, which continues to be cited by historians and philosophers of science, is notable not only for its contribution to those fields, particularly given Dan's later devotion to Jewish culture. His study is also striking for its recovery of the work of a Polish Jewish virologist named Ludwig Fleck, who in the late 1930s wrote a slim volume on the development of innovative scientific ideas that anticipated some of what became Kuhn's much more widely known ideas. Indeed, Fleck only survived the war because the Nazis found value in his medical research. Dan had many abiding interests other than intellectual ones. One that he got to indulge starting in college was his love of sporty cars, when he convinced my parents to buy a used Fiat 600 coupe that he could drive back and forth to Cambridge, first as an undergraduate and then in law school. It was far from the Porsche Roadster that he sometimes dreamed of, but it did have a stick shift, and as always, he shared the enjoyment of it with his little brother, letting me get my share of time behind the wheel. I don't think we ever went beyond 80 miles per hour on the Massachusetts Turnpike, but thanks to Dan, we felt as though we were driving at Le Mans. I have been talking mostly about Dan's growing up, but I want to turn to two other areas before I sit down. The first is Dan's role in my life and in our extended family's life in more recent years, perhaps particularly since our dad died in 2005. As you've heard, Dan's success as a communal leader rested on his being a natural organizer and leader, and he drew on those capacities in our family as well. He, often in league with Karen, of course, was the one who kept nieces and nephews and cousins of every variety in contact, who organized get-togethers for holidays and milestones, large and small, not to mention the occasional journey to sing along Sound of Music, and who at all of those events played the role of the pater familias, offering a wise and usually funny toast or a roast as the occasion required. The second subject I want to say a few words about is Karen, Jacob, and Sam, the center of Dan's life. I remember as if it were yesterday when my brother called me to say he had been dating this fantastic girl and would I like to meet her over dinner. We met at Autre Chose, which in the 1970s and 80s was a popular French bistro on Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the girl I met that evening was indeed a knockout in every sense. Beautiful, brilliant, a super fast talker, and a take-charge feminist. But also someone who shared, as you've heard a little bit, my brother's love of French literature. The look of excitement and pleasure that I saw in my brother's eyes that night when he looked at Karen, I would see again and again over many decades. Karen's love and the life she and Dan built together gave my brother the kind of happiness that only the lucky can experience. Nothing was more important in that shared life than Jacob and Sam. For many years now, Dan and I spoke virtually every week. We would debate US politics, Israeli politics, Jewish communal politics, Jewish liturgical politics, literary politics, and many other subjects, political and non-political. But our main and overriding subject was always our children's doings. What were they up to? How were they feeling? For Dan, when had he last spoken to Jake and Sam, and when would he see them next in person? There is no measure for the pride and concern and joy Dan felt from being Jacob's and Sam's dad. I want to end where I began, standing next to my strong, gentle big brother, my arm around him and his arm around me. I will never feel his physical embrace again, but in my mind and my heart, I know that his warm and supportive embrace will always continue to sustain me.
Thank you, Jonathan. On behalf of Karen, we invite forward Jacob Cedarbaum. And Jacob and Sam will come together. Good. Jake will come alone.
So I'll read some words now on behalf of our mom, Karen Jacobs. Dan Cedarbaum was my husband since 1987, but we were together since 1981, when we were both students at Harvard Law School. He was the love of my life, and I and our entire family are devastated by this loss. We started dating during our second year of law school, and we were together for the next 40 years. In him, I saw a handsome and brilliant man, funny, cultured, and well-read. In me, my mom, he saw a pretty girl who knew how to cook. And Dan certainly had a legendary appetite. He also wanted someone smart, which I was, but everyone knows, and I will admit now, that Dan was much smarter. He was so smart that he would often pontificate on arcane facts that my sons and I suspected he was making up, but rarely had the knowledge ourselves to challenge. We would come to call these dacts, or dad facts. We had almost everything in common, and where we did not, we brought each other into our interests. I instilled in Dan a love for classical music, and he became devoted to Mozart operas, so much so that we would always see Marriage of Figaro or Don Giovanni whenever it played in town. We even dragged our kids to a performance with limited success, and they are long operas. He knew the Italian words to the arias, and although famously tone deaf, would always attempt to sing along. For his part, Dan introduced me to Judaism, which continues to enrich my life. We both relished the cycle of holidays and traditions, especially with our kids. Every Shabbat, he would buy me fresh flowers to decorate our table. We would put up an elaborate sukkah every year, and with it the inevitable arguments between the two of us over which parts went where. The kids would decorate it with non-religious Christmas ornaments and paper chains, and Dan always made sure we did the right blessings and screened ornaments to make sure they were appropriately Santa-free. Judaism was one of Dan's great passions, and he eventually largely retired from law to pursue various Jewish causes. He founded and ran the Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, and in that role, planned and presented numerous important scholarly programs. He sponsored such programs as One Jewish Evanston, which united all branches of Judaism in worship and study. And he was one of the world's foremost scholars on the life and writings of Mordecai Kaplan. For 15 years, he ran a Talmud study group, which I hope to continue in his name. He was a leader and board member of many synagogues and a founder of Camp JRF. During COVID, he led Shabbat and high holiday services in our backyard. He kept the community going, and many said these services sustained them through those dark times. Dan's greatest passion, however, was for his family. He was always holding and kissing our two boys, learning how to change their diapers, even though he was very persnickety about cleanliness. I can still see the joy in his eyes as he would hold our babies during the high holiday services, enjoying the renewal of life in both liturgy and in fact. They knew from day one that they had his unconditional love. And Jacob and Sam, he was so proud of you and loved you so much. Because of my work, which frequently required me to be out of town, Dan was a solo parent for much of the time. He watched over the children with love and attention, going to pediatrician appointments and teachers' conferences, helping with homework and college applications, coaching soccer, taking the kids to Hebrew school, playing board games, golf, tennis. The list is endless. He even deigned to play hearts with us, which, as a lifelong bridge player, he considered to be bridge for idiots. He was at his best on family vacations, sometimes even being willing to play 72 holes of mini golf straight. Frequently, accidents were incurred during these activities, especially while biking. I heard about them only much later. Sometimes there was negligence, such as allowing our two toddlers to play in the Florida sun for hours without sunscreen, requiring a trip to the walk-in clinic for severe sunburn. The kids, who survived, loved him all the same. The attempt by him, my mother, and our longtime nanny Joy to hide the incident from me was laudable, but ultimately futile. But Dan was of the view that fathers were less careful with children than mothers, and that this was a good thing. I think he was right. Our kids are intrepid because of Dan. He truly loved our extended family. He was happy to include my relatives in all of our trips. My sisters, Laura, Julie, and Jessica, and my brother Jimmy know how much he did for them and with them. And my mom, Anne, depended on him from everything from financial management and medical matters to bridge playing and printing online recipes. Dan had his own enjoyments too. He was a consummate foodie and wine connoisseur and knew his way around any wine list. We loved going out to dinner, and I loved cooking for him. There was no more appreciative audience. His own cooking skills were perhaps more lackluster. In college, I once handed him a head of lettuce and asked, "Do you know how to wash this?" He said yes, and then after a few moments of silence, turned to me and said, "Pretend I don't know how to wash lettuce." He loved cars, his latest being a Shelby Cobra, a white Mustang with a big blue racing stripe. The more horsepower, the better. He loved dogs, from his childhood dog Cookie to our late family dogs Briar and Snoopy, and our new puppy Lizzie, with whom he played fetch and raced around the yard endlessly. As a husband, he was attentive and loving. He lavished me books and jewelry and always encouraged me to go shopping or on outings or trips with my sisters or friends. He plied me with candy, despite my ever-increasing waistline. And when I was obsessed with Colin Firth from the A&E Pride and Prejudice, he even got him to send me a signed picture postcard. He rooted for the Cubs during the World Series, despite being a diehard Mets fan. He planned and emceed a huge 40th birthday party for me with speakers and roasts, which remains among my fondest memories. And for my 60th birthday, he even planned a wonderful family trip to Paris with multiple Michelin-starred meals. Dan was a mensch. He was not superficial. He had depth and convictions and made every day count. He was a doer. He had a happy and beautiful and complete life, and he made an indelible mark for good. In the last few days, Dan and I would sit in the yard at night and watch the lightning bugs, which he called fireflies. 2 nights ago, after Dan's death, I was sitting in the yard at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, and saw a lightning bug on the ground. It flashed its light for a time, and then the light stopped. Dan was the light of my life, of our family's life. And while that light is now out, the memory of that light will last us forever. Later, David Jacobson will invite you to the Shiva Ritual at our home. We ask that you confine your comfort for our family to a celebration and remembrance of Dan's life. Tell us your stories about Dan, especially the ones we might not know. Please respect our mourning by lightening our load with these positive remembrances.
Now I'm going to read a few remarks on behalf of my brother and I. First, I want to thank everyone for coming today, especially the many of you who traveled across the country on a moment's notice. It is a true testament to how loved our dad was, and it is such an incredible comfort to our family as we cope with this unimaginable tragedy. To state the obvious up front, 28 and 30-year-old sons are not supposed to eulogize their 62-year-old fathers. We thought we had so much more time with our dad. We should have had so much more time with him. There should have been another 30 years of vacations with family and friends, holidays at the Evanston homestead, watching my brother and I rise in our careers, find loving partners of our own, and perhaps even have the theoretical future grandchildren for whom he had been increasingly impatient in recent years. And then, in an instant, there was no more time. No more plans, no more annoying phone calls in the middle of a 30-hour ICU shift, just wanting to check in. No more desperately needed reminders to book plane tickets, pay taxes, contribute to IRAs, and call our mom more. No more lazy Sunday mornings with bagel and lox. Just the gaping hole at the center of our family where our dad had been. Even as we bitterly grieve the time that was taken from us, we also celebrate and cherish the time that we had. For 30 years, we had the most incredible, loving father that any child could ask for. He and our mother built us a beautiful childhood of unconditional love and support. He and our longtime nanny, Joy, held down the fort at home through our early years while Mom had to travel frequently for work. He was a beloved and surprisingly successful coach of our youth soccer teams, including letting us pick names like the Great Big Red Fire Dragons. He stoically spent hours in poorly ventilated elementary school basements chaperoning the Dewey chess team, signed up for every parent-teacher conference, even for classes like gym and woodshop, dragged us out of bed, kicking and screaming Sunday after Sunday for Hebrew school, raised us with a sense of pride and appreciation for our Jewish heritage, enthusiastically attended all of our minor extracurricular endeavors, from bit parts in middle school musicals and entries in local art shows to volleyball and golf matches. Always willing to take all of the cousins out for one more round of go-karting and mini golfing, even when the rest of the adults were sick of us. When we were older, he taught us the joys of good cheese, excellent wine, and refined scotch. We sparred in reckless 20-mile road bike races down Green Bay Road with more red lights run than our mom was ever allowed to know. He became a super fan of the University of Wisconsin, Carnegie Mellon, and the University of Michigan, with all the tragically color-clashing outfits that entailed. Raucous Thanksgiving dinners, boozy neighborhood winter sing-alongs, cutthroat games of hearts, password, and categories, and our annual trips to Florida and Wisconsin kept us anchored as a family, even as the two of us began to drift across the country and into our own professional careers. Whenever we were back in town, he would already have curated all of our meals for us from a seemingly endless Rolodex of new and interesting local restaurants. He never stopped being there for us when we needed him and when we didn't know we needed him. I personally owe my father for igniting my lifelong passion for computers. I can still remember him patiently showing me how to navigate Windows 95 and explain the difference between a monitor and the computer itself. Later, we even worked together on an iPhone application for the Jewish Reconstructionist Federation. And eventually, what began with me sitting in his lap, waiting for our family PC to boot up, ended with him seeing me get my first job in Microsoft. Perhaps most importantly, he taught us how to be good men, through his example more than anything. Calm but confident, brilliant but respectful, sensitive but steady. A kind and generous friend and host to all. An equal and adoring partner in work, love, and parenthood with our mother. Our dad's life is over now, but the life he lived was beautiful and in many ways to be envied. A wonderful childhood of his own in which he wanted for nothing, the chance to attend some of the finest schools in the country, nearly 35 years of loving marriage to our mother, 2 pretty decent sons, an extended family, and numerous other communities who adored and depended upon him. A successful professional career in law, and eventually the chance to pursue his passion for Jewish scholarship, building his own nonprofit organization from the ground up. His life is over now, but this room full of people he loved and who loved him most is full of lives that will continue on in his absence. Enriched in immeasurable and enduring ways by his warmth and kindness, his spirit lives on in each of us now as we soldier onward together in this still mostly beautiful world. Thank you all again for coming today, and thank you for loving our dad.
Thank you, Sam and Jacob, Karen, Jonathan, of course. Thank you. Now I invite forward Ellen Hargis to lead us in Eli, Eli. Ellen? Friends, please rise as we conclude this part of the service before we go to the cemetery with El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer, inviting forward my colleague at Ezra Habanim, the Niles Township Jewish Congregation, Cantor Daniel Gale.
Menucha אחרונה תחת כנפי השכינה. במעלות קדושים, קדושים וטהורים, קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע, מזהירים את נשמת דניאל בן דב ומרים שהלך לעולמו בגן עדן, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתו. הרחמים הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, ותצרור בצרור החיים, ותצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו. ונאמר אמן.
Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence with the holy and the pure who glow like the light of the heavens to Daniel Goldman Cedarbaum, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in your eternal presence and within the shadow of your wings. Let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And we say, Amen. You may be seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, the interment service will continue at Memorial Park Cemetery located at 9900 Grosse Point Road here in Skokie. For the Shiva information, please note the service folder for times and for minion times. Dietary laws are observed at the residence, and I strongly urge you to read the Shiva etiquette before you walk into the residence. Memorial contributions may be made to Ezra Habonim, the Niles Township Jewish Congregation, or Beth Hillel B'nai Amunah. That information you can also find on the service folder. For those of you who will be driving in the funeral procession to the cemetery, the procession will be forming in our parking lot. Please obtain an orange safety funeral sticker to place on the right-hand side of your windshield. Have your bright lights and hazard lights on at all times. For additional measures of safety, we will be providing many of the cars with a flag that will be affixed to the top portion of your car. We'll have a car in the back of the funeral procession to hopefully keep cars from entering the procession. Use your horn liberally as you're going through the intersections. Please do not speak or text on your cellular phone while driving to a cemetery. At this time, I ask everyone to rise and stand in place, and I invite anyone who's a clergy, rabbi, cantor, Jewish educator, Jewish leader of our community to serve as honorary pallbearers as we escort the casket of Daniel Goldman Cedarbaum from our chapel.